G'day. Today is the fourth instalment in the ongoing discussion about Ted Bundy for the book Ted Bundy, A Visual Timeline. Now today I want to talk about Ted's brain, and I'll start with his prefrontal cortex. In what follows, I'll show you a very brief anatomical discussion about the prefrontal cortex and then discuss some of its major functions in behaviour. And then hopefully we'll be able to apply that to what we know about Ted. And I'll bring some evidence to bear on the discussion about the prefrontal cortex in relation to TED. Okay, so this is an MRI scan through the brain showing you how the brain sits inside the skull. What I've done is I've superimposed two red ellipses onto this to show you where the prefrontal cortex roughly lies in relation to the rest of the brain. As you can see, it sits approximately above the eyes and behind the forehead. This is the same view side on. As you can see, once again, above the eyes and behind the forehead. Okay, so that was an extremely simple anatomical tour of the prefrontal cortex. It doesn't really show you its connections or its finer detail. To do that, I'd have to go into a PowerPoint slide and deliver a more university-style lecture. I don't really want to do that today. What I will do, however, is I'll just now quickly talk about the functions of the prefrontal cortex and some of its connections, so you just get a better idea of its role in the brain. So the prefrontal cortex is often called the executive center of the brain, and it's often described as where your personality is derived from. So it's where your decision making happens, and a lot of your biasing is derived from this area. Basically what it does is it is a comparator. If you think of anything that can compare A and B, it takes an input and compares A and B, and then what it does is, using its connections with other parts of the brain, particularly the limbic system, which is the emotional part of the brain, it can then put a bias onto that comparison and send those bias signals back to other parts of the brain to cause behaviour. So for example, let's say you had in front of you chocolate ice cream and strawberry ice cream, and you were unable to decide between the two of them. As you look at the two ice creams, the information goes into your brain, goes into the prefrontal cortex, and with your emotions getting fed into the prefrontal cortex, the prefrontal cortex then does a comparison. It weighs up strawberry or chocolate, and once it forms a strong comparison between those two, using the bias signals from the limbic system and your memories of perhaps good or bad experiences of ice cream, flavours and so on and so forth in your life, it then puts a bias on that comparison and sends that information back down to your motor circuits and memory and other areas of your brain, which then cause you to say strawberry or chocolate. So that's basically how the prefrontal cortex works. Now, there's another very interesting thing about the prefrontal cortex is its development around the time of adolescence. And around this time, it undergoes what is called neural pruning, where basically a lot of the wild connections that it had from childhood get pruned back and get more stabilized into adult type connections, the kinds of things that adults learn, which is socialization, reciprocity, and those kind of things. And so now, if something goes wrong during adolescence, during that neural pruning process, you can actually end up with a prefrontal cortex that is perhaps subfunctional, that it maybe is not pruned properly, its connections aren't connected properly, and that can result in some kind of behavioral problems later on. So when we bring this information to Ted, we find that something like this perhaps occurred in his brain. Now, if we look at the evidence for that, there's quite a lot of it, and so I'll start with this first piece of evidence here. From all that he said, and all that we now knew about his past, he might as well have been a 12-year-old. His apparent emotional retardation resulted in a diseased pre-adolescent mind directing the actions of an adult male body. Danesworth, 1983, page 17. So here you have Danesworth, or Michaud as I think he calls himself, talking about Ted's prefrontal cortex without actually spelling it out. They picked up on this because when they presented him with emotionally complex questions, they expected essentially mature answers, and what they really got was, the response of a teenager, and inappropriate laughter, at the wrong times and things like that. And what's really interesting here is that when you have a prefrontal cortex which hasn't developed properly, there's both a positive and negative side to that. Also, we didn't really discuss the whole array of causality behind that. We just talked about the neural pruning, but there are other causes as well. You could have genetic factors that Ted could have inherited. You could have had childhood trauma both in the womb or as a young child through head injury, for example, or even toxins in the environment. And of course, emotional trauma. All of these things can result in a stunted prefrontal cortical growth. Now, when talk about both the positive and negative sides of a prefrontal cortex, when you retain the childlike patterns, neural circuits in the prefrontal cortex, what we have is the things that come with children, that is enthusiasm, creativity, the ability to go on tangents easily, cunning, which children have. So these are the kind of, you could call the positive aspects of prefrontal cortical development when they're still at the childhood level. But the negative side, of course, is lack of stamina, lack of concentration, lack of focus, inability to integrate information, and most importantly, perhaps inability to control, desire for things. So you get, instant gratification, and, desire to have something now. You want it now, as opposed to, being patient and working hard for it and getting it through hard work. So these kind of patterns came through to Michelle Danesworth, and hence they arrived at their conclusion that he had a pre-adolescent brain driving an adult body. Okay, so now I'll present the next piece of evidence, which comes from Polly Nelson and her book, Defending the Devil. Ted had real deficits in judgment, awareness, and deeper thinking. He could talk and write, but he couldn't comprehend or respond. He was incapable of independent thought or elaboration. If I probed his statements, he was unable to explain himself or take an idea deeper. Polly Nelson, 1994-61. What Polly Nelson is talking about here is Ted's inability to integrate information. And this is important because conceptual information is often of that type. That is, we take lots and lots of individual pieces of information and we put them together in our mind, and then from that we extract a concept. And this comes about through an ability to have a bird's eye view over the whole information map. Typically, children are great at collecting lots and lots of small pieces of information, independent pieces of information, and learning lots and lots of small rules. But they have trouble in integrating those rules into a conceptual idea of the whole rule set. And this is basically just defined as a lack of integration. And this is where the prefrontal cortex plays a very important part, because its role is to do exactly that. It's the part of the brain that does all of those bird's eye view conceptualizing processes. And that's what you notice in Ted, that he was, like a child, able to learn lots and lots of little rules and collect lots and lots of individual pieces of information, but he had the inability to put them together into a cohesive whole. And this actually goes further back. Liz even talked about that when Ted was writing his essays. Often he would be rushing them right to the very last minute to their deadlines, because once again he'd be able to learn all the rules, but to actually put it together into a proper cohesive written essay that had some kind of conceptual spine to it, that was where he kind of had problems, and she actually had to help him finish his things on time. Now, I might be saying things out of turn here. I don't know exactly what he wrote in some of those essays, but I'm making an assumption that this kind of follows the pattern that seems to also occur in a lot of his court cases as well, where he was able to often take individual depositions and the like, but he seemed to, even though he was following the rules step by step, these didn't require him to actually link all the rules together and form a more conceptual overview of where is this whole story going, where am I taking this? He lacked the overall big picture story of what was going on, and this is often a sign that the prefrontal cortex is not functioning properly. Okay, so now I'm going to introduce the last piece of information. Once again, it comes from Ted himself, and this is what he had to say. In junior high school, everything was fine. Nothing that I can recall happened that summer before my sophomore year to stunt me or otherwise hinder my progress. But I got to high school and I didn't make any progress. How can I say it? I'm at a loss to describe it even now. Maybe I didn't have the role models at home that could have aided me in school. I don't know. But I felt alienated from my old friends. They just seemed to move on, and I didn't. I don't know why, and I don't know if there's an explanation. Maybe it's something that was programmed by some kind of genetic thing. In my early schooling, it seemed like there was no problem in learning what the appropriate social behaviours were. It just seemed like I hit a wall in high school. Michelle Danesworth, 1983, 58. Well, there's a lot going on here, and in fact I kind of overlooked two important concepts regarding the prefrontal cortex that I didn't discuss earlier, which we have to kind of go into now to make more sense of this. But before I do, I'll just talk about the timing issue here. Ted clearly talks about the problem arising somewhere between junior high and high school, and this is interesting because it actually coincides with the neural pruning that's supposed to go on during adolescence, and suggests in fact that Ted might have had a neural pruning problem. Of course, the etiology of that, as we discussed earlier, we're not sure. It could have been genetic, it could have been traumatic, it could have been a toxin, could have been brain injury. There's all kinds of possibilities, we're not sure, but typically it is genetically driven, and Ted even intimated himself that maybe he felt it was genetic because maybe he felt he didn't have enough other influences that could have caused it. So in his mind, certainly the genetic hypothesis was at the top. So this left him obviously feeling confused and baffled at his peers who at around that time were learning more mature socializations, reciprocity and those kind of things. And Ted's response to that would have been confusion and isolation. And to prevent himself from feeling that, that would have probably driven himself more into his shell and resulted in him becoming more lonely and looking at behaviours that were more isolated and introverted. So now what I didn't discuss earlier was two other important things about the prefrontal cortex, which was the one of them is the fact that it plays a very important role in working memory, that is sequential tasks. So, doing A, then B, then C, then D, and so these kind of tasks can actually make the brain quite tired. And if you've already got an under-functioning prefrontal cortex like Ted had, then if you give him a whole bunch of tasks which are sequential in nature, then that can really cause kind of an exhaustion and leave him feeling quite drained. And in fact, because he's using his prefrontal cortex to understand social behaviour, this would in turn make it even harder for him to understand social cues and the like, and make him feel like he just doesn't understand the world, that he's just like an alien in the human world. And the other thing that's really important about the prefrontal cortex is it plays a major role in inhibiting the limbic system, which is the emotional engine of the brain. And if the prefrontal cortex starts failing, then the emotional circuitry can start dominating. Those emotional behaviours can start punching through and start exhibiting in behaviours, tantrums and inappropriate emotional expressions, inappropriate socializations. And so if Ted was feeling himself exhausted and that he might have then started expressing inappropriate behaviours, then additionally, that would also stimulate him to withdraw into his shell to prevent himself from having those embarrassments. So it's a double whammy there. Now, there's a very important concept here that covers like an umbrella the whole issue, and that is called ego exhaustion, and that is when a person has to go through all these processing operations with the prefrontal cortex, which results in the cortex being exhausted. It actually results in the person's ego, that is their desires, their wants, their needs, the things that they think about themselves and others, and their self-identity. These things can start feeling like they're they're failing, that they're unable to, your person's unable to have control over them anymore. So that when ego exhaustion starts setting in, the problem is then that the person's ability to put off instant gratification becomes severely hampered. It becomes compromised, so that now when their ego is exhausted, when emotional circuits start punching through and say desire starts kicking in, it's much harder then to resist desire, much easier just to try and get out and get what you want. Whereas when you have full control over the limbic system through your prefrontal cortex, you can basically avoid instant gratification. You can have delayed gratification. You can wait until the right time to express your desires. And so there's a whole complex going on here. It's all interconnected, and it seems that Ted was a victim of his prefrontal cortex in this sense. Now, I've gone through this in a kind of very rushed way, and it really needs to be unpacked and discussed in more detail, item by item, but this is quite a long video already today, so I'll finish up now, and I'll then take it on with the next video. I'll unpack some of these things in more detail and go through it specifically more from a neuroscience point of view in terms of the prefrontal cortex and its relation to the limbic system and the other parts of the brain, the thalamus, and of course the visual cortex and the auditory cortex. So I'd like to discuss these things in more detail. Also the insular cortex and the anterior cingulate. These are parts of the brain that all interconnect with the prefrontal cortex and can be part of the problem when you look at it from a kind of a global point of view. So I'll leave it there now, and we'll start unpacking all of these things in more detail in the next discussion. Okay, cheers.